The jungle was alive with sounds. Strange creatures cried in the distance, and thick mist curled around the massive trees like ghostly fingers. Commander Ethan Drake moved carefully, his boots sinking into the damp earth. His pulse was steady, but his mind was alert. He was trained for survival. Still, this planet was unlike anything he had ever seen. His ship, the Orion's Edge, had been ambushed in deep space. One moment, everything was normal. The next, enemy fire had torn through his hull. He barely had time to eject before the ship exploded. Now he was stranded on this unknown world, his distress beacon broken, and no way of knowing if rescue would ever come. Drake pressed a hand to his ribs. He had hit the ground hard during the crash, and his body ached from the impact. His black and gray survival suit had absorbed most of the damage, but pain still burned through his side. He could ignore it, for now. As he walked through the dense jungle, he took in his surroundings. The trees were enormous, their thick trunks covered in glowing blue moss. Vines dangled like snakes, and the air smelled of damp earth and something unfamiliar, something metallic. His stomach growled. Food, that was his next priority. He had emergency rations in his survival pack, but he needed to make them last. Who knew how long he would be here? He found a clearing and decided to make camp. He gathered dry wood and started a small fire using his survival kit. The flames flickered weakly, but it was enough to provide warmth and light. He opened a ration pack, chewing slowly while listening to the sounds of the jungle. Then, movement. Drake tensed. His hand went to the sidearm holstered at his hip. His keen eyes scanned the trees. Something, or someone, was watching him. He stayed completely still, letting the firelight dance in his peripheral vision. There, a shadow moved high up in the trees, almost too fast to follow. Drake's instincts screamed danger, a predator, or worse, an intelligent enemy. He slowly reached into his pack and pulled out a small motion sensor. He activated it with a silent press of his thumb. A red dot blinked on the screen, moving above him. It wasn't an animal crawling on the ground. It was in the trees. Drake narrowed his eyes. He had seen many alien species in his years as a soldier, but this one was different. It moved like a hunter, watching, waiting. He took a slow breath. He had two choices: wait for it to make a move or force its hand. He chose the second. With a quick motion, Drake grabbed a small rock and hurled it toward the tree. The rock struck the trunk with a sharp thunk. In an instant, the shadow vanished, leaping to another branch with incredible speed. Drake was on his feet in a heartbeat, gun raised. "Come out," he called, his voice firm but not aggressive. "I know you're there." Silence. Then a low, clicking sound, almost like laughter. Drake's grip on his weapon tightened. That wasn't the sound of an animal. It was intelligent. Then she appeared. A figure dropped from the trees, landing gracefully a few meters away. She was humanoid but not human. Her skin was a deep bronze, with faint patterns that glowed softly under the firelight. Her dark hair was tangled, wild, and her piercing golden eyes studied him with curiosity and caution. She was thin but strong, dressed in what looked like scraps of armor and torn fabric. A knife rested at her hip, but she hadn't drawn it yet. Drake kept his gun raised. "Who are you?" The woman tilted her head, her expression unreadable. Then, in broken standard Terran, she spoke. "You? Not from here." Drake's eyes narrowed. "No, and you." She hesitated. Then she took a slow step forward, raising her hands in a non-threatening gesture. "I am Exile." Drake frowned. That wasn't what he expected. "Exile," he repeated. "Your own people cast you out." The woman nodded once, then looked around, scanning the jungle as if expecting something, or someone, to appear. Drake didn't lower his gun, but something inside him shifted. This planet was dangerous. If she had survived here alone, then she was either incredibly skilled or running from something worse. And if she was in exile, it meant there were others like her, somewhere on this world. Drake's survival instinct kicked in. If she was cast out, then whoever sent her away might not be friendly to outsiders like him. The woman glanced at the fire, then at him. "You should not be here," she said simply. Drake almost smirked. "Trust me," he muttered. "I don't have a choice." The jungle shifted around them, the night growing deeper, the sounds of distant creatures echoing through the trees. For now, they were just two strangers in the wilderness. But Drake had a feeling this planet held more secrets than either of them had time to prepare for. Drake didn't lower his gun. The woman stood across from him, golden eyes reflecting the firelight. She didn't seem afraid, but she wasn't reckless either. She kept her distance, one hand resting near the knife at her hip. The jungle around them was full of life, distant roars, rustling leaves, the chirping of strange insects. But at this moment, it felt like only the two of them existed. Drake spoke first. "What do you mean, I shouldn't be here?" The woman studied him, tilting her head slightly, as if choosing her words carefully. "This world, not safe." Her voice was quiet but firm. "For you, more dangerous." Drake let out a slow breath. "Yeah, I figured that out already." He gestured toward his damaged survival suit. "Crash-landed. No way off this rock. You got a ship hidden somewhere." She frowned, not understanding all his words, but she shook her head. "No, no ship." Drake sighed. "Didn't think so." A sudden noise in the trees made both of them tense. A low, guttural growl, followed by the rustling of leaves. Something was watching them. Drake adjusted his grip on his gun, but the woman reacted first. She moved fast, her body low, eyes locked on the darkness beyond the firelight. Her hand gripped her knife now, muscles coiled like a predator about to strike. Drake had seen skilled fighters before, his own squad back in the Terran Expeditionary Corps. But this woman moved differently. She wasn't just trained. She had survived in this jungle for a long time. The growling grew louder. Drake glanced at her. "Friend of yours?" She didn't look away from the trees. No. The leaves exploded outward as a massive beast leaped into the clearing. It was at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark, leathery skin. 4 muscular legs, sharp claws, and glowing red eyes. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged teeth. A predator. Drake fired. 3 quick shots. The bullet struck the beast's thick hide, making it snarl in pain, but not stopping it. The woman moved in a blur. She leaped onto the creature's back, knife flashing. Drake expected the attack to fail, but she knew exactly where to strike. Her blade plunged into a soft spot behind its skull, cutting deep. The beast let out a terrible cry, thrashing wildly, but she held on. Drake fired 2 more shots, aiming for the creature's exposed neck. This time, it collapsed. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, the woman rolled off the beast's body, breathing heavily. Drake lowered his gun. "You're good." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she wiped her blade clean on the grass and turned to him. "You? Slow." Drake smirked. "Yeah. Well, next time I'll let you handle it." She eyed him for a moment before stepping closer to the fire. Now that the danger had passed, Drake could study her more closely. She wasn't just a warrior. She was a survivor. Her clothes were worn and patched together, made from scavenged armor and animal hide. Her skin bore scars, some old, some fresh. "You have a name?" Drake asked. She hesitated, then said, "Kellara." Drake nodded. "Ethan Drake." She repeated his name slowly, testing the sound. "Drake." He sat back down, motioning for her to do the same. She hesitated but eventually lowered herself onto a fallen log, keeping some distance between them. Drake took a sip from his water flask, then offered it to her. She stared at it for a moment before taking a careful drink. "So," he said, watching her, "you said you're in exile. What did you do to get kicked out? Calera's expression darkened. She looked away, staring into the fire. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then, finally, she said, I asked too many questions. Drake frowned. Questions about what? She didn't answer. Instead, she reached into a small pouch at her side and pulled out a strange metal object. She held it up, letting the firelight shine on it. Drake leaned forward. It was a piece of old technology. Something ancient, but still intact. This, she said quietly, not from my people. Drake's mind raced. If this planet had old tech, it meant someone had been here before. Maybe even humans. Calera studied him, then spoke again. You want to leave? Drake gave a short laugh. Of course. I don't plan on dying here. She nodded. Then you need to come with me. Drake raised an eyebrow. Where? Calera stood, slipping the metal object back into her pouch. Her golden eyes met his. To the ruins. To the place of the old ones. Drake didn't know what she meant exactly, but one thing was clear. This planet held secrets. And if there was even a small chance that those ruins had a working distress beacon, he had to find out. He grabbed his pack and stood. Lead the way. Calera nodded once, then turned, disappearing into the jungle. Drake followed, his instincts sharp. He had crashed onto this world alone. But now he had an unexpected ally. For better or worse, their journey had begun. The jungle was thick with mist and shadows, the air heavy with humidity. Calera moved with ease, her bare feet barely making a sound on the damp ground. Drake, on the other hand, felt every twig and leaf snap under his boots. His movements were heavier, clumsier, but he was learning to move with the jungle. Slowly. The strange, eerie sounds of the alien wildlife surrounded them. Low growls echoed from the distance, and strange rustling in the trees made the air feel charged with danger. Calera didn't seem concerned, but Drake kept his hand near his sidearm. He wasn't used to trusting anyone, especially not someone who had been cast out by her own people. So, what exactly are these ruins you're talking about? Drake asked, breaking the silence. Calera glanced over her shoulder, her eyes sharp. The old ones. My people didn't build them. She paused, as if weighing her words. But my people fear them. Drake frowned. He didn't like it when people talked in riddles, but he wasn't about to press her too hard. Not yet. Instead, he nodded and kept his questions to himself for the time being. They walked for hours, deeper into the jungle. The farther they went, the more the landscape seemed to change. The trees grew taller and more twisted, their bark shimmering with an almost metallic glow. Strange, luminous flowers bloomed along the edges of the path, casting an eerie light in the darkness. Drake kept his eyes open, scanning the surroundings. He had been in jungles before, on Earth, on distant moons, but this was something else. The jungle here felt alive in a way he couldn't explain. It wasn't just the plants or the animals. It was as if the land itself had a presence, something watching, waiting. As they pushed forward, Calera led him to a clearing, where the ground was covered with soft, damp moss. There, hidden beneath a canopy of twisted trees, lay the entrance to something ancient, an enormous stone archway, half covered in vines. It looked like it had been there for centuries, maybe even longer. Drake stepped forward, feeling a sense of awe. There were no signs of modern life here. No Turin markings, no traces of anything human. This was old, older than any civilization Drake had ever encountered. Is this it? He asked, his voice low. Calera nodded. Yes. She moved past him, slipping through the archway like a shadow. Drake followed, stepping cautiously behind her. The moment he passed through, he felt a shift in the air. The jungle sounds faded, replaced by an eerie silence. It was as though they had entered a different world. The space beyond the archway was vast. It was like a cavern, but instead of a roof, there was an open sky. a sky that glowed with an unnatural light. At the center of the clearing, an ancient structure stood, a towering stone pillar covered in strange symbols. They were etched into the surface, some glowing faintly. Drake approached it slowly, his hand on his gun. But Kellara stopped him. "Don't touch it," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "It's not safe." Drake frowned. "What is it?" "It's a gateway," Kellara explained, her eyes glinting in the dim light. "Not a doorway to another place, but to knowledge. My people fear it because it's not theirs to control." Drake didn't fully understand, but he didn't argue. If this thing had been around for centuries and was still standing, it was clearly important. He turned to Kellara. "So, where's the beacon?" Kellara didn't answer right away. She walked to the side of the pillar and knelt down. There, hidden among the vines, was a small panel embedded in the ground. Kellara pressed it, and the stone beneath her hands shifted, revealing a holographic map of the area. The map flickered for a moment before it stabilized, showing several locations marked in glowing red. Kellara pointed to one near the center of the map. There, the beacon. Drake's heart skipped a beat. That was the answer he was looking for. "All right," he said, checking his supplies. "Let's go." But as he turned to leave, he felt a strange tingling sensation on the back of his neck. He glanced up, his instincts screaming that something was wrong. Behind them, the entrance to the ruins was no longer empty. Figures were standing in the shadows, tall, cloaked forms, their faces hidden. Drake's hand instinctively went to his sidearm. "Who are they?" he hissed, keeping his voice low. Kellara's face paled. "Vaylari." Drake froze. The name meant nothing to him, but the fear in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice tight with urgency. Before Drake could ask any more questions, one of the figures stepped forward. It was tall, with pale, angular features. The hooded figure held a long staff, and its voice was cold and commanding. "Kellara," the figure said, "you have returned." Drake's grip on his gun tightened. More of her people, but they didn't look like allies. Kellara stepped in front of him, her posture defensive but strong. "I do not belong to them anymore." The figure's voice softened but carried a dark edge. "You were cast out, yes, but the Vaylari always return for their own. You cannot escape us." Drake wasn't sure what was happening, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going down without a fight. "You're not taking her," Drake said, stepping forward, his gun raised. The figure didn't seem concerned. "You are human," it said with a cruel smile. "You will learn your place." Drake's heart raced. This wasn't good. But as he stood there, facing down this new threat, he realized something. Kellara wasn't just an exile. She was important, maybe more important than he had first realized. And if he wanted to survive this world, he would have to learn everything he could from her. But right now, they needed to get out. Fast. The air grew heavy with tension as the figure before them spoke. The Vaylari, a group whose name now carried a weight of fear for Kellara, stood poised in the shadows. Their presence was commanding, and their silence unsettling. The leader's cold, almost hollow voice sent a shiver down Drake's spine. "You cannot hide from your past forever, Kellara." The leader spoke, their voice soft, but full of authority. "The Vaylari always find what is ours." Kellara didn't flinch. Her stance was defiant, though Drake could see the tension in her muscles. She was ready to act at a moment's notice. Drake stepped forward, his hand still gripping his gun. He had no intention of letting these people take her, whatever they were. He could already tell that Kellara's exile was tied to something much bigger than he had originally thought. Something that could have dangerous consequences. "Stay back," Kellara whispered to him, her voice low but urgent. "This is my fight, not yours." Drake didn't move. "We're in this together. You want to make it out of here. We need to stick together." The Vaylari leader's eyes, piercing and sharp, turned to him. The figure didn't speak immediately, but instead studied him as if deciding whether he was worth the time to address. Finally, the leader's lips curled into a faint, mocking smile. "The human speaks," they said, their voice laced with quiet amusement. "Do you truly believe you can survive here, outside the safety of your ship, surrounded by enemies?" Drake's grip tightened around his weapon, but Kelleher raised a hand, stopping him from speaking. She took a step toward the Valeri leader, her eyes locked with theirs. "I have no intention of returning to you," Kelleher said firmly. "I've walked this path alone for too long, and I'll walk it again if I must." The leader's smile faltered, and they took a step closer. "You misunderstand. We do not wish to force you to return. Not yet. At least, we have a much more interesting offer for you." Drake glanced at Kelleher. The idea of any kind of offer from these people sounded dangerous. Still, he trusted her instincts, even if he didn't fully understand everything about her past. "What do you want?" Kelleher asked, her tone still wary but intrigued. The leader's voice grew softer. "You will find the beacon," they said. "We know it is here, hidden somewhere in this world. You will find it for us, and in return, we will grant you what you seek." Kelleher's eyes narrowed, distrust filling her gaze. "And why would I do that?" The leader took a step back, their hood shifting slightly in the breeze. "Because you want to know what happened to your people. You want to understand the truth of your exile. We have the answers you seek, Kelleher." Drake could see the internal battle play out in her expression. She was torn, caught between the need to protect herself and the burning curiosity about her past. "What is it that you're hiding?" Kelleher's voice was quiet but sharp, each word heavy with suspicion. The leader's lips curled again, but the smile didn't reach their eyes. "We are not hiding anything. We are offering knowledge. The truth you have longed for." Kelleher stood silent for a moment, her eyes scanning the Valeri leader's face. Drake knew she was considering the offer, but he also knew how dangerous it was to trust them. Drake didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, breaking the uneasy silence between them. "And what if we say no?" he asked, his voice firm, challenging. The Valeri leader's eyes shifted toward him, their gaze cold as ice. "Then you will remain here, lost in the jungle, with no way to escape. Your ship, gone. Your future, uncertain. You will have no way off this planet. Your people will never find you." Drake's jaw tightened, but he didn't back down. He understood the threat now. These people could make his situation worse. Much worse. Kelleher, however, seemed to be weighing the offer seriously. After a long, tense silence, she finally spoke again, her voice steady. "I'll need time to think. I'll do it, but only on my terms." The Valeri leader's eyes gleamed. "You are wise, Kelleher. You understand. The clock is ticking. You have 3 days to make your choice. Find the beacon, or you will never see us again." With those final words, the leader turned without another glance, and the Valeri retreated into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as they had arrived. Drake let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. For a moment, he felt the weight of the situation. The offer they had made was dangerous. It was clear they had power that could manipulate the entire situation. But at the same time, they had information that Kelleher might need to uncover her past. It was a gamble. Kelleher stood still, her gaze locked on the empty space where the Valeri had been. She was quiet, almost lost in thought. Finally, she spoke. "We can't trust them, Drake," she said softly. "But we don't have much choice. If they know where the beacon is, it's our best shot at getting off this planet." Drake nodded slowly. He understood her reasoning, even if he didn't like it. "What now?" Kelleher had turned to face him. "We find the beacon on our own terms, and we stay ahead of them. We can't let them control us. Not again." Drake agreed. He was used to making decisions under pressure, but this one was different. There was too much at stake, and the Valeri had already shown how much power they wielded. They needed to move quickly, before the Valeri had a chance to act on their offer. And so, with no more words to be spoken, the two of them set out again. Kel-Era led the way, her steps swift and confident, and Drake followed closely behind, prepared for whatever dangers lay ahead. The journey was just beginning, and every step would bring them closer to the truth, to the beacon, and to the shadowy figures who seemed to control so much of this world. But no matter what happened, Drake was sure of one thing. They were not going down without a fight. The jungle was darker now. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the eerie glow of alien flowers was the only light that guided their path. The weight of their decision hung heavy between Kel-Era and Drake. The Valeri's offer had been clear: find the beacon or risk never leaving this place. But Kel-Era's words kept echoing in Drake's mind. "We can't trust them," she had said. Still, they had no choice but to follow the path that the Valeri had laid out for them. The beacon was their only hope of escaping this planet, and Kel-Era's exile had to end. She deserved the truth, the answers she had been searching for. But in his gut, Drake knew that what they were walking into could be far worse than they imagined. They made their way deeper into the jungle, the dense foliage around them pushing in on all sides. Kel-Era led the way, her steps light and swift, while Drake followed closely behind, always alert. The jungle was alive, but the deeper they went, the quieter it became. The strange creatures that had made their presence known earlier were now gone, leaving only the sound of their footsteps in the thick undergrowth. "We're getting close," Kel-Era said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her golden eyes scanned the trees as though she could see something that Drake could not. Drake looked around but saw nothing unusual. The trees were tall and ancient, their trunks thick and covered in moss. The air was heavy with moisture, and every now and then, a strange bird-like creature would call out from somewhere in the distance. But it was nothing like the sounds they had heard earlier, the growls, the rustling. It was quiet now. "How do you know?" Drake asked, keeping his voice low. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she knelt down and placed her hand on the ground. Her fingers brushed the damp earth before she stood up and nodded toward a small clearing ahead. "The beacon. It's there." Drake squinted into the darkness. He could just make out the outline of something large and metallic hidden among the trees. It looked out of place, an unnatural shape in the natural world. The beacon. They moved toward it cautiously, their steps deliberate. As they neared the clearing, the outline of the structure became clearer. It wasn't just any piece of tech. It was huge, covered in vines and moss, but unmistakably alien. The metal surface shimmered in the faint light, and strange markings were etched into its surface. There was no doubt in Drake's mind that this was the beacon the Valeri had mentioned. Kel-Era approached it first. Her hand hovered over the surface of the object, but she didn't touch it immediately. She was waiting. Drake couldn't help but notice the way she studied the structure, cautiously, as if it might spring to life at any moment. "Do you think it's safe?" Drake asked, stepping closer. "I don't know," Kel-Era replied, "but we have no choice. We need to activate it, or they'll come for us." Drake glanced around, half expecting the Valeri to appear at any moment. But the jungle remained silent, undisturbed. "All right," Drake said. "Let's get this over with." Kel-Era nodded, then placed her hand on the surface of the beacon. The moment her fingers made contact, a low hum filled the air. The ground beneath their feet seemed to vibrate slightly. The beacon was waking up. Suddenly, a loud sound, like gears shifting and metal grinding, echoed from within the beacon. It began to glow, soft at first, then brighter. The strange markings on its surface shifted and rearranged, lighting up in a sequence Drake couldn't understand. "What is it doing?" he asked, watching the display with growing concern. "It's opening," Kel-Era murmured. "Opening a connection." Drake felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. This was no ordinary beacon. It wasn't just a signal transmitter. Whatever this thing was doing, it was more than just calling for help. The hum grew louder, and Drake could feel the ground tremble beneath him. It felt as though the entire jungle was reacting to it. "Should we stop it?" Drake asked, his fingers hovering over his weapon. But Kel'Era shook her head. "No, we need to know what it is. We need to know what the Vaylari want with it." Before Drake could respond, the air seemed to rip open with a sharp, piercing sound. It was a physical tear, but the sky above them flickered, and for just a moment, the very atmosphere seemed to bend. Kel'Era stepped back, her expression hardening. "They're coming." Drake's heart raced. "What does that mean?" Kel'Era didn't answer. She was already moving, stepping back toward the trees. "We don't have much time. We need to get out of here." But before they could leave, the clearing around them seemed to shift. From the trees, more figures appeared. Not the Vaylari, but something far worse. The creatures from the jungle, the ones they had heard growling in the distance, had come. They were drawn to the beacon. Drake's hand went to his sidearm as he moved to protect Kel'Era. The creatures circled them, their eyes glowing in the darkness. They were massive, covered in thick, spiked hides, and their teeth gleamed like razors in the faint light. "We need to fight," Drake said, his voice low but firm. Kel'Era nodded. "Stay close to me." She didn't wait for him to reply. She moved with lightning speed, darting toward the nearest creature. Her knife flashed, a quick strike that sent the creature stumbling backward with a howl. But more were coming, and they weren't backing down. Drake fired, taking down one of the creatures that lunged toward him. But there were more. The jungle seemed to come alive with them, and every time one fell, another took its place. It was chaos. The air was filled with growls and the crack of weapons firing. But Kel'Era was in her element. She fought with grace and precision, each movement a dance of survival. Drake covered her back, using his training to keep the creatures at bay. Together, they made a dangerous team. But the real danger was not the creatures. They were only part of a much larger problem. The Vaylari were closing in. As they fought back, Drake realized that the beacon was not just a signal, it was a trap. They had activated it, and now the true battle had only just begun. The air was thick with the sound of battle. The creatures from the jungle, massive and ferocious, circled around Kel'Era and Drake. Their glowing eyes pierced through the darkness, their growls echoing through the clearing. But it wasn't just the creatures that made the situation dire. It was the dangerous truth that had dawned on them. The beacon was a trap. Kel'Era moved with a fluid grace, her blade cutting through the air, striking down another creature. The beast let out a screech as it fell to the ground, its body crumpling into the underbrush. But more were coming. Each time one fell, another appeared, as though they were drawn to the beacon's pulse. Drake fired, his aim steady as he shot at the next creature that lunged toward him. His heart pounded in his chest, but his focus remained sharp. He couldn't afford to make mistakes. The odds were stacked against them, and it was becoming clear that the Vaylari had not just wanted the beacon, they had used it to bring this chaos upon them. "Kel'Era," Drake called out, dodging the claws of another creature. He fired once more, but it didn't stop the relentless onslaught. "We need to get out of here." But Kel'Era was already thinking ahead. Her mind was always one step ahead of their enemies. She glanced around, searching for any sign of the Vaylari. They had to be close. They were the ones controlling the beacon, and if they had set the creatures loose, it meant they were planning something worse. "We can't leave," she said, her voice determined but calm. "If we run, we'll be running forever. We have to finish this." Drake's eyes widened as he saw what she meant. The clearing was full of creatures, and the beacon was glowing brighter, its hum resonating with the sounds of the jungle. There was no escape. They had no choice but to face the true enemy. "You're right," Drake said, his grip on his gun tightening. "Let's do this." Kel'Era nodded sharply, and in that moment, the two of them fought together in perfect harmony. Drake provided the cover, while Kel'Ara went on the offensive, her blade slashing through the creatures with deadly precision. But the creatures weren't the real threat. It was the Vaylari who were using them as a distraction. Drake suddenly felt it. A shift in the air. The atmosphere grew heavier, colder. Vaylari had arrived. From the shadows, figures appeared, stepping into the clearing with eerie confidence. They were tall, cloaked in dark robes that billowed with every movement. Their faces were hidden, but their presence was unmistakable. The Vaylari had arrived to finish what they started. Kel'Ara's eyes narrowed as she recognized them. So they were waiting, she muttered under her breath. They planned this from the beginning. Drake, eyes flicking between the creatures and the Vaylari, felt his heart race. They knew this would happen, he said. The creatures, the beacon, it was all part of their plan. The Vaylari leader stepped forward, their voice cold and authoritative. You should have joined us, Kel'Ara. But you chose this path, and now you must face the consequences. Kel'Ara gritted her teeth, but she didn't show fear. I won't join you. Not now, not ever. The leader's voice softened, but the threat behind it was undeniable. You don't understand, Kel'Ara. The beacon is a gateway. It leads to something far greater than you can imagine. We control it. You need us to survive. Drake could feel the tension building, but Kel'Ara stood her ground. I don't need you, she said, her voice steady. I'll destroy the beacon before I let you control it. The Vaylari leader's lips curled into a smile. You won't get the chance. With a signal, the Vaylari moved forward, their hands raised in an unfamiliar motion. The creatures paused, as if responding to their commands. The jungle seemed to grow still, the air thick with the weight of the Vaylari's power. Drake knew what was coming. The Vaylari were going to unleash something far worse than the creatures. Without warning, the ground beneath them trembled. A deep, resonating hum filled the air, growing louder by the second. The jungle around them began to shake as if it were alive, responding to the power that the Vaylari were channeling through the beacon. No, Kel'Ara shouted. She rushed forward, her blade raised, but before she could get closer, the Vaylari leader raised a hand, and the ground cracked open beneath her feet. A surge of energy shot upward, sending Kel'Ara flying backward. Kel'Ara, Drake shouted, rushing to her side. But Kel'Ara pushed him away, her face set with fierce determination. I'm fine. We need to stop them now. The Vaylari's power was growing, the air around them vibrating with an energy that felt almost unnatural. The creatures seemed to pause, watching as the Vaylari continued their ritual. The beacon hummed louder, and the glowing symbols on its surface flashed like lightning. Kel'Ara's eyes burned with anger. We have to shut it down. Now. Drake nodded, understanding. They didn't have much time before the Vaylari completed whatever plan they had in motion. But the creatures weren't done. As if on cue, the massive beasts charged again, more aggressive than ever. They had become mindless, controlled by the Vaylari's power. We can't fight them all. Drake shouted, firing at one of the creatures that lunged at him. We don't have to fight them, Kel'Ara said, her voice low and intense. We just have to stop the beacon. The Vaylari leader's eyes gleamed, seeing the desperation in Kel'Ara's expression. You can't stop it, the leader said, voice dripping with confidence. The power is already rising. You're too late. But Kel'Ara wasn't listening. With a swift motion, she dashed toward the beacon. Her eyes were fixed on the control panel hidden among the glowing symbols. She reached it, her hands moving with purpose. The moment her fingers touched the surface, the beacon seemed to respond, the symbols shifting once again. She was close. Drake held off the creatures for as long as he could, but it was clear they were running out of time. Kel'Ara looked back at him, determination in her eyes. Get ready, Drake. We end this now. The clearing was alive with energy. The Vaylari's power pulsed through the air, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to vibrate with an unnatural force. The creatures surrounding Cal-Era and Drake were growing more aggressive. But there was no turning back now. The beacon had to be stopped. Cal-Era's hands moved quickly across the control panel, her fingers pressing against the symbols that flashed brightly beneath her touch. She could feel the weight of the Veilari's power pressing down on her, but she refused to back away. The beacon was dangerous. It was their only way off this planet. But it was also a weapon. And the Veilari were using it to manipulate everything around them. She glanced back at Drake, who was fighting off the creatures with all his might. His gun fired again, and another beast collapsed to the ground. But they kept coming. It was a losing battle. They couldn't keep this up forever. I need more time. Cal-Era shouted over the roar of the battle. Drake didn't hesitate. I'll cover you. Just hurry. Cal-Era's heart pounded as she focused on the beacon. She could feel the energy building, the hum growing louder with each passing second. The Veilari were desperate to keep control of it. If they completed whatever ritual they were attempting, everything would be lost. The symbols beneath her hands shifted again, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw something. A pathway, a way to shut the beacon down completely. Her fingers trembled as she pressed harder against the panel. A sharp cry from behind her pulled her attention back. A creature had managed to break through Drake's defenses and lunged at Cal-Era. She spun just in time, her knife flashing in the dim light. The creature hissed and staggered back, but it was not enough to stop it. More were closing in. We're running out of time. Drake yelled, his voice strained as he fired another shot. He was tiring, and the creatures weren't relenting. Cal-Era gritted her teeth. She couldn't let them die here. Not like this. She had to finish it, and she had to finish it now. She forced herself to ignore the creatures circling them, the pulse of energy from the beacon growing stronger. There was a weak spot. She could feel it. With a deep breath, Cal-Era slammed her palm onto the panel, pressing the final symbol. Suddenly, the air seemed to crack open. A bright light erupted from the beacon, blinding them both. Cal-Era shielded her eyes, but she could feel the ground shaking beneath her feet. The creatures halted, their eyes wide as they backed away from the light. It was as though they were afraid, the unnatural energy that had controlled them now retreating. Drake spun around, his eyes narrowing as the light filled the clearing. What did you do? I stopped it, Cal-Era said, her voice low but full of resolve. The light was still blinding, but she could feel the beacon beginning to lose its power. It was weakening. The Veilari won't control this anymore. But the Veilari leader was not backing down. He stepped forward, his robes flowing behind him like shadows. His face remained hidden, but the weight of his presence was unmistakable. You think you've won. The leader's voice was cold, yet somehow filled with amusement. You've only delayed the inevitable. Cal-Era's hands were still on the control panel, her fingers trembling from the effort. The beacon's light flickered, but it wasn't enough to stop the Veilari yet. They weren't finished. The leader's power pulsed around them, sending a wave of energy through the air. You may have stopped the beacon, but the power it carries is already inside of you, Cal-Era, the leader said. You've activated it. It's too late. Cal-Era looked back at Drake, her face filled with determination. We're not giving up. Before the Veilari could do anything more, a loud crackling noise filled the air. The beacon's energy surged again, but this time it was different. The light dimmed, and the ground beneath them seemed to collapse. The jungle itself seemed to groan in pain. The beacon is collapsing. Cal-Era shouted. Drake's eyes widened as the first signs of the beacon's destruction became clear. The metal began to crack, the glowing symbols flickering like a dying star. The Veilari leader reached out, his hands glowing with a furious energy. No, he screamed. You cannot stop this. But Cal-Era wasn't listening. She pulled away from the panel, her heart racing. She knew what had to happen next. The beacon was about to implode, and if they didn't get out of the way, it would take them with it. Drake grabbed her arm. Cal-Era, we need to move. Now. She didn't hesitate. She ran, dragging Drake along with her, as the entire clearing seemed to collapse into itself. The creatures, too, were retreating, as though they sensed the danger. The Vaylari leader, however, remained standing, his expression twisted in fury and desperation. But there was nothing he could do. The beacon had become unstable, and its power was now beyond his control. As they reached the edge of the clearing, the beacon exploded. A shockwave of energy blasted out, sending Kalera and Drake flying backward. The jungle was filled with blinding light and deafening sound. For a moment, everything seemed to vanish. When the light finally faded, Kalera blinked, trying to clear her vision. The beacon was gone. The jungle was silent, and the creatures were nowhere to be seen. Only the Vaylari leader remained, but even he seemed to have been affected by the blast. He was on his knees, his energy flickering like a dying flame. Kalera stood up slowly, her body aching from the force of the explosion. She turned to Drake, who was already by her side, his face grim but relieved. "We did it," she said softly. Drake nodded, but he wasn't smiling. "For now. But this isn't over. The Vaylari will want revenge." Kalera's eyes were hard, but her voice was steady. "Let them come. We've survived worse, and we'll keep fighting." They stood together, looking out over the jungle. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. And as the stars above began to shine, they knew their journey was far from finished.